Welcome to SuperTalk Outdoors, where we celebrate every single Monday at lunchtime the world class outdoors of the state of Mississippi because we're the capital of the outdoors in America. I really appreciate you joining us. It's February the 10th, 2025. Amazing to me how fast time is flying, but I know that I say that a lot. Hey, listen, last year when a Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks commissioner was caught hunting turkeys on a baited field, a lot of questions started to be raised. Wait, first of all, the bait was crickets, and a lot of us had never even heard about that before. Of course, we did our research and discovered that it's not necessarily something new. It's not widely used, but it does come up from time to time, and it has been around for a while. Um, and by the way, incidentally, in case you were not aware that that happened, that commissioner was not reconfirmed, so there's no worries there. But for the first time, and as far as I'm concerned, I started to really kind of get locked in on the discussions around supplemental feeding in general. And what I learned as we continue to have this conversation was that the statute in Mississippi and the commission and the wildlife game wardens, how they implement the statute, there seems to be a bit of a disconnect, and there's a little bit too much discretion engaged in that. And we'll talk to you more about specifically what that's about. I got into a conversation with my friend Will Primos, and he sent me a note and said that he had been talking with a young man by the name of Mark Lance, who's with the Congressional Sportsmen Foundation. And he said this that about the screwed up turkey supplemental feeding rules in Mississippi and the ambiguity of it all. This is Will talking, which leaves the law up to discretion of the game warden. One day you are guilty of hunting turkeys over bait, and the next day you're not. Sun wardens say you are hunting on baited field or feeder is anywhere near your property, even if it's 2 miles away from where you are hunting. And some say you are not hunting a baited field. We need to clean up this legal interpretation so that turkey hunting public will know what they should do and what they shouldn't do. And it goes on from there. It also points out that grain, sorghum, wheat, sunflowers could be broadcast or a spin feeder, no crack corn or corn, and maybe set the limit at 200. But he's not saying that we need to, he's not necessarily proposing exactly what the resolution should be, other than simply making the point that it needs to be fixed. And so I've decided to invite Mark Lance, the guy that Will was talking to, who's with the Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation and the Southeast States policy coordinator, and ask him to join me today so we can chat about it. So without any further ado, let me welcome Mark to Super Talk Outdoors. How you doing, Mark?
I'm doing great, Ricky, and I appreciate you having me join the show.
It's good to see you. I mentioned I had a thought in my mind about what you look like, and then of course we met this morning. And I was, you're from Mississippi. It's really an interesting story. Why don't you tell people about how you came into this position?
Yeah, so like you said, it's pretty interesting, and I won't bore you with all the details, but I started out my educational career here at Northwest Mississippi Community College, to take over, my general curriculum and all that, because I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do, post graduation. But I knew I loved to hunt. I knew I loved to fish. I knew I loved to be outdoors, like so many of your listeners, and that led me to transfer to Mississippi State University in the College of Forest Resources. And I had full expectation that once I graduated from there, I would go on to work for a state fish and wildlife agency as a biologist or a conservation officer or what have you. But one day during my junior year, I got an email from our career center with an internship posting with the Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation, working on hunting and fishing policy across the country and there in Washington. And I said, well, living in DC for 3.5 months might be pretty interesting, and it's stuff that I enjoy doing. So I applied for the position, was lucky enough to get it, and spent 3.5 months in DC and had a blast, and was lucky enough to get hired on full time upon graduation from Mississippi State, and the rest is history.
So you're now the Southeastern States Policy Coordinator, and you're dealing with state law, not federal law, in your current responsibility, correct?
Yes, that's correct. So I'm our lead in our southeastern region, which is comprised of 9 states. I work directly in 4 of those, being Florida, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, and then my colleague also covers the other 5 in our southeastern region. So it's February, legislative sessions are rolling, and there's no shortage of work for sure.
But Mark, what's interesting is I'm in just preparation for this. I just wanted to kind of get boned up myself about the Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation. And what I learned is the Congressional Sportsmen's Caucus, on the national level, is extraordinarily bipartisan, and you got some of the strongest leaders in the United States involved in it. Again, I'm not surprised to see that. I mean, I often say here in Mississippi that we're going to have big debates around policy, liberals versus conservative, and so et cetera. But when we get in the outdoors, man, a lot of those issues go to the wayside, and we can join hands on the issues that are important to us. And you really see that in your work, don't you?
Absolutely. And to your point, the issues that we work on pertaining to natural resource management, specifically hunting and fishing and recreational shooting and trapping, those aren't partisan issues. That is something that, party lines are blurred. And to your point, the Congressional Sportsmen's Caucus on Capitol Hill is the largest bipartisan and bicameral caucus on the Hill. So, yeah, to your point, it's these issues that we work on are extremely bipartisan and something that everybody can rally around, because we all want clean water. We want an abundant, fish and wildlife resources, etc.
And listen, I saw where several members of Congress were having talking about the foundation and the caucus and why it was important to them. I even saw a speech from Will Primus back in 2012. Amazing that he's had a big impact like that. But it's great to have someone like Will Primus engaged in issues, isn't it?
Yeah, and having a figure like Will Primos that is such an important advocate, for wildlife conservation, not only in the state but across the country, and for him to talk so highly about the foundation and all of our caucus groups, it's incredibly important because everybody knows Will Primos. I mean, he's the truth about hunting. So
Yeah, he. I think sometimes he forgets how strong his voice is, how important his voice is, not just in Mississippi, but really across the country. That is for sure. So when you give people the sort of the elevator speech on the Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation, how do you talk about it?
sure. So just the elevator pitch on it. The Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation, we're a 501c3 nonprofit that's based out of Washington, D.C. And our mission is to protect and advance pro hunting, fishing, recreational shooting, and trapping legislation and regulation, not just on Capitol Hill, but across the country. And we're able to accomplish that mission through the facilitation of our 3 caucus groups, those being the Congressional Sportsmen's Caucus, which we've already touched on there in DC, the Governor's Sportsmen's Caucus, which is obviously made up of governors across the country. We've got 22 active members right now, with Governor Greg Gianforte of Montana currently serving as chair of that caucus. Last year we had about 30 governors as members, but with the November elections, there was some turnover there. And then finally, the National Assembly of Sportsmen's Caucuses, which is made up of all 50 state legislative sportsmen's caucuses from across the country. So each state has their own legislative sportsmen's caucus, which mirrors what we have on Capitol Hill in DC. And those are the groups that I, as a member of our state's program team, work closely with. And at its peak last year, we had nearly 2,500 members. So 2,500 state legislators from across the country were affiliated with the NASC network, which is around, I believe it was just under 40% of all state legislators nationwide that have come together to show their support for their constituents who hunt, fish, shoot, and trap.
As I've often said, there can't be enough eyeballs on the process. Because as you know, man, first of all, some issues can be difficult, some can be debated. We can get off base in some can be much needed. There are some good intentions, and maybe in some cases, maybe not so good intentions around things that could get slipped into bills at the last minute. So again, you can't have enough eyeballs on it, and to have a caucus that's engaged and communicating with one another, and where there's sort of a way to network and share each other's observations. That's hugely important, isn't it?
Absolutely, and that's where, like I said, our state's program team comes in, and we've got 10 full-time employees across the country that are doing the same job that I am in different regions, and we can facilitate that information. Say there's an issue that's happening in Alabama, and we had worked on it previously in Kentucky. We can we can take that information that we learned working that initiative in Kentucky and providing that information to those folks in Alabama. So
We'll be back with the Congressional Sportsmen Foundation after this. Welcome back to Super Talk Outdoors. I appreciate you joining us as we continue to celebrate Mississippi's outdoors. Listen, are you looking to purchase your perfect piece of hunting property, upgrade your farm equipment, or have you been dreaming of owning your slice of heaven out in the country? Look no further than Mississippi Land Bank for your financing needs. For more than 100 years, farming families and landowners in North Mississippi have turned to Mississippi Land Bank for all kinds of financial solutions, whether it's for land, equipment, or livestock. For more information, visit mslandbank.com or go by and visit one of their friendly staff at any of their offices. We're thrilled to have Mississippi Land Bank as a sponsor of Super Talk Outdoors. We're visiting with Mark Lance from the Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation. He's the Southeast State Coordinator. When we went to break and we were running out of time, I just want to make sure we focus on this point, that, as I mentioned, we can't have enough eyeballs on the legislative process. And the reality is that when you have these eyeballs happening in each of the states, in his case, the southeastern states of America, you're able to share observations and best practices and laws, and it's great to be able to tap into that, isn't it, Mark?
absolutely, and we might touch on it a little bit later, but a key example of that is, there's a license fee reimbursement initiative that we're pushing across the states, right? And we're using model legislation that was passed in Tennessee in 2017. Former NASC Executive Council member, State Senator Mike Bell, and we're taking that legislation that was passed. That what it does is, if the legislature were to pass a free or discounted hunting and fishing license for whatever group, then the state would be on the hook to reimburse the State Fish and Wildlife Agency for that loss in revenue. So it's a protective measure to ensure that the legislature doesn't cut away at revenue that the department is generating, because most departments are self-funded through license sales, right?
Yeah.
So we take that model legislation and we take it to other states like Mississippi, like Louisiana, and some of these others, and have those bills introduced and work on.
Yeah, listen, I mentioned the mandatory harvest reporting legislation that's working its way through. I think we need that for people who hunt specific species that have that already. They know that it just helps to be able to gather the data. Those of us on the Mississippi Gulf Coast know it well, because every time we go offshore, we have to go into the app and report what we're catching. And then, of course, the establishment of a wild turkey stamp in Mississippi. It didn't make it through the legislature last year. It seems to still be getting hung up in the Senate. We'll have to reach out to Delbert Hoseman and talk a little bit more about that. But the reality is, this should be a no-brainer, shouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Something like the wild turkey stamp. I know the department has done surveys with licensed hunters in the state, and the vast majority, I think over 70%, are in favor of paying that a little bit extra, to go towards habitat conservation, specifically to the wild turkey. So, I mean, you're looking at 70 to 80% of hunters in the state that are saying, yeah, we're willing to pay more. It's surprising that it's getting hung up the way that it is.
Well, listen, it's turkey hunting, the wild turkey story in Mississippi, going back to all the efforts many years ago to make conservation and efforts to be able to have wild turkeys in the way that we have them in Mississippi. So it's a great story in and of itself. And then you add to that the success of it and how we're doing year to year and how many people are wanting to come into this state from outside. The wild turkey story in Mississippi is a great one. And we need to be able to have conservation efforts. We need to be able to capture data. There are a lot of reasons why the turkey stamp would work for us. And speaking of turkeys, the way I kicked the show off, I had somebody call me Saturday and said, "Man, we've got a corn feeder on our property. Can I go, if I don't hunt anywhere near there, can I still go hunt?" And I said, "You know what? To be honest with you, I don't think so because there's too much discretion. We've got to clean that up, even if we're going to clean it up temporarily." Tell us about the disconnect between what's happening in terms of implementing and what the statute says.
Yeah. So as you touched on earlier in the show, I was on a quail hunt with Will Primos several weeks back, and long story short, he informed me that this was a problem. And I live in North Mississippi. I live in a CWD zone. We can't feed on private property, period. So this is never an issue that's ever been brought up around here. But in talking with Will, I was like, "Well, what are some things that you would like to see changed in Mississippi?" And he said, "Mark, I'm gonna be honest with you. I don't know if I can turkey hunt my own property or not." And of course, that kind of took me back. And I was like, "Well, why is that the case?" And he said, "Well, I've had," and let me preface this by saying this is not a dig at the department. This is not a dig at our conservation officers, because they have a hard job, right?
Yeah.
And I just want to preface that. But he's like, "Mark, I've had game wardens come out and look at my property and tell me, absolutely not. If there's a feeder with feed in it, you cannot hunt this property." And I've had others come out and tell me, "Oh, you can absolutely hunt this property, just don't hunt within close proximity to that feeder." And I started digging into it, and I looked at state statute, and state statute is very clear, and that you cannot directly or indirectly feed wild turkeys in hopes to hunt or to hold onto your property to hunt them, right? Nobody's debating that. Where the ambiguity comes in is there have been rules promulgated by our Game and Fish Commission that allow for the supplemental feeding of deer year round, right? So that would also include the spring turkey season. So to be in line to ensure that you are not breaking the law, are you telling me that you have to remove that feeder, or you have to remove that feed during the spring turkey season? And nobody can really get a clear answer on that. And that's something that needs to be fixed, because it's unfair to the private landowner. It's unfair to the game wardens that are having to use that discretion to interpret the laws and the rules promulgated by their commission. And it's unfair to the licensed hunters of the state, who may or may not know that they're breaking the law if they're hunting a property that has a feeder on it.
Yeah. So yeah, I think maybe there's an interim step to clean this part up, so people at least can know what they need to do and how do they do it in a way that is lawful. As you know, we continue to collect data across the state of Mississippi as it relates to CWD. We're sharing data with other states. Best practices are emerging. I've talked long and hard about it. One of the first things we do when a CWD zone is declared, and you mentioned this where you live, is they stop supplemental feeding. And because there's a direct correlation between the spread of CWD and supplemental feeding, it's really undeniable. So I think eventually our state's going to have to really deal with this. And should we be allowing supplemental feeding across the state? And with that, if we deal with that the way it needs to be dealt with, this won't even be an issue. But I think we're still a ways away. I think data is still coming together. Eventually, this is going to be a really important conversation that the commission is going to have, and I understand it. I think our goal is to slow the march of CWD down and give science a chance to catch up, because it is real, and in certain areas of the state, we've reached a level of prevalence that is to the point of no return in some respects, and they don't see any mature deer anymore. And what this means for deer hunting in America is not good. And we've got to be very aggressive in Mississippi to do what we can to slow it down. So those are pending issues in our future that I think we're going to have to deal with. In the meantime, it might not make sense. It might make sense, excuse me, to address this issue in the short term. And that's the point that Will is trying to make, because people who are currently legally supplementally feeding deer could potentially be breaking the law if they hunt turkey on their property because of the way the statute is written, and right now it's up to some discretion, and that's never a good thing. I think really when it comes to breaking the law, you need clarity, don't you?
Absolutely, and to backtrack there, CWD is running rampant up in this part of the state, and there definitely needs to be a conversation had surrounding supplemental feeding, at a state level, because it's continuing to spread. I'm not discounting that at all, but to your point, there needs to be a temporary fix so that we can ensure that the ambiguity in this situation is removed, so that and just for example, if I were to hunt a property somewhere that I didn't know had supplemental feed on it or had a feeder on it, and I got ticketed for it, I mean that negatively impacts me and my profession, right? And I would be none the wiser that I was doing anything wrong. And I think a lot of people in our state would fall into that same category, and I don't even think that they're aware that this is an issue. So to your point, I do think that there should be a temporary fix done. In the conversations that I've had, I think that a distance restriction put in place specific to the spring turkey season under the supplemental rules that have been promulgated by the commission is the cleanest fix to this. Handle this problem now, and then down the line, let's have a bigger discussion surrounding supplemental feed and CWD and all that. But I think that we need a fix on this to clear this ambiguity up sooner rather than later.
Well, the good news is I've talked to some commissioners. I think they're having some internal conversations about that. I'm sure that there's going to be more public discussion about it, but it's really clear to see what the issue is, and you can fix this now and still have a future conversation about supplemental feeding in general, which we all know they're going to have. Listen, it's been a pleasure to spend some time with you, Mark.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really appreciate you having me on to talk about this. It's an important issue for me, both professionally and personally.
You bet. This has been Mark Lance from the Congressional Sportsmen Foundation. Hey, when we come back, we're going to talk about fishing in coastal Mississippi. We'll be right back.